Long before the first steps were taken back toward Jerusalem, the word of the Lord had already been spoken. Through the prophet Jeremiah, God had declared that the exile would not last forever. After 70 years the captivity would end, the land would be restored and the people would return. Years passed. Kingdoms rose and fell. Empires shifted. And far from their homeland, in the land of Babylon, the people of Israel waited. Among them was Daniel. As he read the writings of the prophets, he understood that the years of exile were drawing to a close. The promise had not failed. God's appointed time was near. Yet Daniel did not respond with celebration or confidence. Instead, he humbled himself, fasted and prayed. He confessed the sins of his people and pleaded for mercy, knowing that restoration would come not through strength or strategy, but through repentance and grace. By this time, Babylon itself had fallen. The great empire that had carried Israel into exile was now under the rule of Persia, and Cyrus sat upon its throne. The world had changed, though few yet understood how much. And then, quietly, without spectacle or announcement, the hand of God began to move. A decree was issued by this foreign king, the captives were free to return, and Jerusalem and the house of God were to be rebuilt. What armies could not accomplish, and exile had not erased, God brought about through the will of a ruler who did not even know his name, just as the prophet Isaiah had written 150 years earlier. What they found when they arrived was not the city they remembered. Jerusalem lay in ruins. Its walls were broken. Its gates were burned. The place where the presence of God had once dwelt stood silent and exposed. Stones lay scattered where worship had once risen. The city bore the scars of judgment and neglect. Yet even among the ruins, hope remained. Zerubbabel, appointed by King Cyrus to lead the return, gathered the people together, and they began again, not with walls or defenses, but with worship. Before a single stone of the city was restored. They rebuilt the altar and offered sacrifices to the Lord, turning their hearts once more to the God who had never forgotten them. About 2 years after they had returned, the foundation of the temple was laid, stone by stone. And when it was finished, the sound that rose from the people was unlike any other. Some wept aloud, remembering the former glory that had been lost. Others shouted for joy, seeing hope reborn before their eyes. Grief and celebration mingled together, and the sound carried across the city. Opposition did not come slowly, it came almost at once. As the foundations were laid and the sound of worship returned to Jerusalem, the surrounding peoples took notice. They had lived in the land during the years of exile, and the rebuilding of the temple threatened their influence and control. And what began as offers of help soon turned to resentment when it was refused. Mockery followed, then intimidation and finally accusation. Letters were sent to Persian officials at the king's palace, casting suspicion on the builders and questioning their loyalty. When the letter reached Artaxerxes, the then ruler of Persia, it was read aloud before him. Carefully worded, it spoke of rebellion and unrest. It warned that if Jerusalem were rebuilt, the city would rise again in defiance, refusing tribute and challenging royal authority. So the king ordered the records to be searched. And in the archives of the empire, the past was uncovered. Jerusalem had indeed been a city of kings. It had known revolt before. It had resisted foreign rule. And so, persuaded by what he read, Artaxerxes issued a command that the work was to stop. A decree was sent back with urgency. The rebuilding of Jerusalem was to cease immediately and no further progress was to be made until another command was given. When the order arrived, the opposition acted at once. By force and intimidation, they brought the work to a halt. The sound of stone on stone faded. Tools were laid down and the unfinished foundations were left exposed to the sun and rain. And so the work on the house of God came to a standstill. Not because the people lacked faith, but because fear had taken hold and the voice of authority had spoken against them. The foundation remained silent and unfinished, waiting for the day when God would speak again. But God had not abandoned his people. He sent his prophet Haggai, who spoke plainly and with urgency. He reminded the people that while they lived in comfort, the house of God lay in ruins. He called them to consider their ways and to see that their frustration and lack of peace were not accidents but signs that something greater had been neglected. Shortly after Haggai, he sent another prophet named Zechariah, whose words lifted their eyes beyond the rubble. Through visions and promises, he reminded them that God had not forsaken Jerusalem, that his Spirit still dwelled among them and that the work they feared to begin again would be accomplished. Not by might, nor by power, but by the Spirit of the Lord. The message was clear. The delay had not meant abandonment and the opposition had not meant defeat. More importantly, his silence did not mean God had abandoned them. He had brought them back to the land not simply to build but to trust. And as the people listened, something began to change. The work began again, quietly but with resolve. Hands once stilled by fear now moved with purpose. Though the people had returned to the work with renewed resolve, the opposition had not disappeared. Those who lived around Jerusalem watched the rebuilding with growing unease. Once again, accusations were raised and once again, questions were asked. And soon, messengers were sent to the Persian court, warning that if the city were allowed to rise, rebellion would surely follow. The matter was brought before the newly appointed King Darius, but he did not act in haste. Instead, he ordered the royal records to be searched. Scrolls were unrolled, clay tablets were examined, and the history of the empire was carefully reviewed. And there, among the archives, the decree of Cyrus was found. It was written plainly and without ambiguity. The Jews had been granted permission to return, to rebuild the house of their God, and to do so with the authority of the king himself, and so when Darius heard the words, the matter was settled. He upheld the decree of Cyrus and issued a new command of his own. The work was to continue without interference. No one was to hinder it, and more than that, the cost of construction was to be supplied from the royal treasury. What had been delayed by fear was now protected by royal authority. And so the work began again, quietly at first, but with growing confidence. Stone by stone, the house of God rose from its foundations until at last the temple stood complete. Worship could now return to Jerusalem. After years of silence, the altar stood once more upon its foundations. Sacrifices were offered again, just as the law had commanded, and the sound of prayer rose where only wind and ruin had remained. The temple, long unfinished, now stood rebuilt, modest in glory compared to the past, yet precious in meaning. When Ezra arrived in Jerusalem, he did not come as a ruler or a builder, but as a teacher of the law of God. The people gathered as word spread that a scribe had come, one devoted not only to the scriptures but to living them. He stood among them and began to speak, opening the law that had long been neglected. His voice carried through the crowd as he read and explained the words, making their meaning clear once more. And as the people listened, something stirred within them. They heard again who they were, and to whom they belonged. The words cut deep, not with condemnation, but with remembrance. For the first time in generations, the people were being shaped again by the word of their God. Songs once silenced were lifted again. Offerings were made. The rhythm of worship returned to the city. Yet even as praise filled the courts of the temple, the city beyond its walls remained exposed. Jerusalem stood vulnerable, its gates burned, its defenses broken. Worship had been restored, but safety had not. And so, while the temple stood complete, the story was not yet finished. Far from the broken stones of Jerusalem, life continued as normal in the courts of Persia. Nehemiah, a Jew who lived there, and served as cupbearer to the Persian king, a trusted position that placed him daily in the presence of power, yet far from the broken city of his fathers. Surrounded by order, wealth, and security, far removed from the ruined city of his ancestors. His body dwelt in a foreign palace, but his heart remained in Jerusalem. When he heard that its walls still lay in ruins and its people lived in disgrace, sorrow overtook him in a single, heavy moment. He sat down and wept, fasted, and prayed. In that place of grief and quiet surrender, God placed a burden upon his heart, not simply to mourn what had been lost, but to rise and help restore it. Trusting in the God of heaven, Nehemiah asked the king for leave to return and rebuild the city of his fathers. It was a bold request, one that could have cost him everything. But the Lord was with him. The king's heart was moved, and permission was given for the walls and gates to be restored. When Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, he did not speak at once. Instead, by night, he walked the broken walls, surveying the damage and counting the cost. The task before him was immense. But he knew the work was not his alone. When he called the people together, they rose to the challenge. Families took responsibility for the sections of wall nearest their homes. And so, stone by stone, the city began to rise again. But opposition followed, the old enemies mocked them. Threats were made and plots were formed. But the people did not stop the work. They worked with tools in one hand and weapons in the other. By day they built and by night they stood guard, refusing to be distracted from the task, and in just 52 days, the wall and gates were finished. What armies could not accomplish, faith had achieved, not by strength or the power of men, but by the hand of God. When the work was complete, the people gathered together. The law was brought out and Ezra read it aloud from morning until midday. As the words were spoken, the people wept, not in despair, but in recognition. They had forgotten much, and so they confessed their sins, renewed their covenant and committed themselves once more to walk in obedience. The people were home, the city was rebuilt, and the covenant renewed, but they were still waiting. Waiting for the fulfillment of the promises spoken long ago by the prophets. Waiting for the king who would not rebuild walls of stone but restore hearts of flesh. And so the Old Testament draws to its close, not with triumph, but with expectation. And so began the long silence. 400 years passed, the voices of the prophets were quiet. Generations rose and passed away, empires came and went. Yet beneath it all, the promise remained, waiting, and unchanged. And when the time was finally right, when the world least expected it, God would act again. Not with thunder or armies, but with a child. And in that quiet moment, history turned and hope was born into the world. The return in the golden thread. God keeps his word. From exile to return, every promise spoken through the prophets was fulfilled in its time. Empires rose and fell and kings issued decrees, yet the purposes of God remained unshaken. What he speaks through his prophets always comes to pass. Restoration begins with the heart. Before walls were rebuilt or cities secured, God restored worship. The altar was raised, the law was read, and the people were called back to obedience. True restoration is not about the physical. It's about returning hearts. God works through ordinary people. Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah were not kings or warriors. They were servants, scribes, and builders. Yet through prayer, courage, and obedience, God accomplished what power and force never could. Opposition cannot stop God's purpose. Threats came. Work stopped. Fear spread. But what God began, He finished. Even royal decrees could not overturn His will. When the time was right, the work resumed and was completed. The story was still pointing forward. The temple stood, the walls were rebuilt, and the people were back in the land, yet the story was not complete. They were waiting for a king, not merely to restore buildings, but to restore hearts and make all things new. Yet when He came, many did not recognize Him. Instead of receiving Him, they rejected Him and nailed Him to a cross. But even this was not the end, because through His death came redemption. And through His resurrection came the promise that one day Jesus will return, and all things will be made right. If you found this video interesting and would like to explore more, we have several options for you. One is our free, multilingual, Bible-based Christianity course, a free 30-lesson video course covering all aspects of the Bible and daily life. Another is the Bible by Stories, a series of over 50 videos that takes you on a journey from creation to the early church. And if you have questions about Scripture, there is a multilingual chat system on the website where you can ask any question on scriptural issues. To access any of them, simply visit the website listed below. If we don't yet have videos or the course in your language, please email us at the address shown, telling us what you are interested in and your language, and we will do our best to create them for you. God bless you on your walk to God's kingdom.